today we are focusing on male mental health under conflict, under conditions of conflict, under conditions of displacement, and of course with specific reference to the genocide. In studio with us this morning, we are joined by Professor Ashraf Kaji, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at Stellenbosch University. He is also the co-director of the Ellen Fisher Center for Public Mental Health and is a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Shukran for joining us, Prof.
Alaikum salam, Khadija. Thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here.
And one of the reasons why we realized, Prof, that somebody like yourself, that you are really well placed to speak to us about this, because a lot of your work previously has always been around mental health. As a psychologist and a researcher, mental health concerns of people living under conditions of oppression and marginalization. And of course, we with specific reference to South Africa, but you've also previously served on a working group of the World Health Organization that examined ways of diagnosing stress-related mental disorders. You've attended conferences in Gaza, and you are part of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program.
So I'm not part of that organization, but I've certainly worked there and have taught at the Gaza Community Mental Health Program since 2016, which is the first time I visited Gaza. And I've had a close association with them, but I'm not employed by that organization.
But the reason why it's so important for us to mention that is again because your work as a psychologist, your work as somebody who does a lot of research in that area, of course, being focused on a space like South Africa, where we know, and again, I'm reticent to use that terms because I'm a lay person, but when one speaks about, norms and values, how one is conditioned, particularly men are conditioned to behave, and what oppression and living under the colonial gaze has done for men and to men, and when we think about masculinities, and so perhaps just to open up the conversation, we always hear that generally for men, it's a difficulty to speak about mental health. Why is this? And I know it's a huge question, but just to sort of frame the discussion for us before we get to the crux of it.
Firstly, it's not only for men. I think most people feel that they want to keep their mental health problems private. And I think that's quite normal, that's quite natural. If people don't want to speak publicly about things like depression, anxiety, substance use, trauma, those are personal matters, those are private matters. I think having said that, though, there is a huge amount of stigma and shame about having a mental health condition. We might all know someone who has a psychological problem or a psychiatric problem like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression. It's not necessarily something that people want to talk about a lot. And I think there has been a great deal of stigma associated with it. It's changing a little bit now, but I think for many people, there's a sense of shame, there's a sense of humiliation, there's a sense that they might be thought of as being weak. And so for a lot of people, it is a silent phenomenon. I think for men specifically, there are some constructions of masculinity, I suppose would be the way to put it, where there's an idea that men should be strong, men should be resilient, and having something like depression, anxiety, traumatic stress shows some kind of weakness, that their masculinity is being called into question, which is of course a myth, because men experience these mental health conditions in just the same way that anyone else does, that women and children do, and elderly people do, etc.
Now, is this sort of compounded all that what you described now, and the whys behind why it seems as if men would be more sort of reluctant to speak about this? Would that be magnified or compounded under conditions of conflict, or looking to your previous work under conditions of oppression and marginalization?
So I've conducted research in this country, in South Africa. Some years ago I did a study on trauma and stress among people who were detained during apartheid, and the associated mental health problems that arose as a consequence of being abused in detention. And then in Gaza, with the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, we also studied things like depression, trauma, anxiety, and this is before the current genocide. And under those conditions, where the problems are largely political, I mean, these are political problems. The current genocide, the ongoing occupation of Palestinian land, the way in which Palestinians have been treated by Israel, these are political, human rights, social justice matters that have consequences downstream when men, for example, in Palestine, many of them have been in Israeli prisons, for example, over the years. They've been abused, some of them have been tortured even before the genocide. And so, as a consequence of that, traumatic stress, mood disturbance, anxiety, even substance use, we conducted a study some years ago on tramadol use in Gaza. Tramadol is an opioid, a painkiller that also is habit forming, and it produces a sense of euphoria. So there have been instances in Gaza where men especially, but also women, have used tramadol as a way to cope with the ongoing trauma of injustice in Gaza. This is now before the genocide. The genocide that started 2 years ago brought into focus all of this in a hugely traumatic way for pretty much everybody in the Gaza Strip and in Palestine more generally.
And there's so much just contained within that. I mean, and just to sort of reference back to what I said right at the very beginning, we know when we speak about particular norms and values and cultural norms, we know associations made with men as being the protectors and the providers. So one doesn't even think, or we're not even starting to unpack that in relation to a genocide. And so again, one wants to reference back to when you speak about your work in South Africa and having been oppressed and marginalized, and we know about the structural injustices and particularly what happened with men as they were taken away from their families. We think about migrant laborers, and we think about that system and what that has done to masculinities and yes, to familial spaces and to families. And so of course we realize that physically how that impacts them, but of course not even going into the mental health. And it would be interesting for us on another day, Prof, perhaps to sit down and speak about that. So now you speak about that type of situation under a genocide, and yes, we know this has happened long before the Al-Aqsa flood, which started in October 2023, and it feels like too big a question then to speak about the lived experience, say, if one looks at the Palestinian male, but just to frame the next part of the conversation for us. Take us through some of that and some of your own findings.
Well, I think for men in general, and this applies to men in Palestine as well, there's a need to protect their families, to provide a safe space for their children to grow up. Men want to defend their families from harm. In the context of the genocide, this has become impossible for men to assume that role, because everybody has been at risk of getting killed over the past 2 years. And men also want to provide for their families. They want to provide food, shelter, education. And again, in the context of Gaza, where there has been deliberate starvation, this deliberate starvation campaign has made it difficult and in some instances impossible for men and parents more generally to provide these things for their children. And for any parent to watch their child starve is of course excruciating. There's a traditional assumption that that men provide for their children, and in that context the consequences are devastating psychologically for men. And I'm talking about this now in a sense separately from all the killing and destruction and the rubble and the mass murder of people. We're now focusing more on the psychological aspects. even with with the ceasefire, currently food is not getting in sufficient quantities, and 1 years of continued Israeli attacks on people, even after the ceasefire has been agreed to. And so, in this context where men actually are helpless to provide these important things for their children, for their wives and children, the consequence of this helplessness can be quite debilitating. So I think that is the one important thing. The other is the absence, or not the absence, but the limited availability of mental health treatment for people in Gaza. At the moment, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program continues to work. They continue to provide counseling, psychotherapy, in certain cases, medication for people who require it. But their buildings have been destroyed by Israel. There were 3 buildings in Gaza, all of which have been reduced to rubble, and the clinicians currently working in Gaza are operating in makeshift tents and temporary structures. So we're talking now about an enormous need for mental health treatment as a consequence of these human rights violations, as a consequence of this genocide, and also the limited availability of treatment. So there's a mismatch between what is needed and what is provided.
Yeah, and then one thing is, of course, also of the necessary expertise in that area. I'm sure that the team from, as you referenced, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program are trying the very best. But I mean, I'd like to now just also refer to the report that you sent on to us. This is the documenting the scale of the ongoing psychological and humanitarian catastrophe that we know that, yes, it's preceded October 2023, but really how now in current in the current circumstance, people are really living through what is said to be one of the harshest humanitarian crises of modern times. But what I found so interesting, Prof. Kaji, as I mean, when you sent this on to us and I started reading through it, is that it references some of the most vulnerable groups, because it speaks about that. So before we get to numbers or anything like that, and I just thought it's so interesting, given that our conversation, we want to focus on men, and the groups that are referenced would be women, children, the elderly, and those with disabilities.
Yes.
And I didn't see a particular section for men.
I think you're completely right. I think this report that you're referring to, which is produced by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, has sought to focus on who they think are the most vulnerable in society. And I think it kind of touches on what we've been speaking about earlier, that people who are considered vulnerable are children, are the elderly, are women, and not necessarily men. But of course, this conversation is about the fact that men also are vulnerable. Men also are susceptible to conditions like major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress, substance use conditions, psychotic conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, a range of very difficult and challenging mental health conditions that society in general is experiencing. But I think your point is correct, that this report that you're referring to appears to have not focused on men that much.
But what it then says to me, if I was a male and I picked this up, and then I would think, there's no justification for me to, or let's say by default, I ought to be that strong person because I'm not considered to be vulnerable. So it's almost as if it sets me outside that group. And I understand why. I understand that, yes, we do that and we speak about men and women, but I'm saying this almost like concretizes that idea that I ought to be a lot stronger and a lot and a lot more resilient. And again, as a layperson, I realize that, you know, in terms of the mental health program, there's reasoning behind it. In terms of psychological reasoning, there's reasons why this was done. But I just thought, you know, the I don't know if I can call it the irony of that we are saying that in order to have, let's call it complementarity, because we never want to play off, you know, the idea that, you know, this group is more important or that group is more important. But exactly because of those sort of those stigmas and those associations, made with masculinity.
I think your point is correct, actually. And I think this conversation is really important, the one that we are having right now, calling attention to the fact that men are not immune from mental health problems, from depression, from anxiety, from fear, from worry, from a whole range of various conditions that can be quite debilitating, that involves a huge amount of mental distress, emotional distress, and suffering. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about this with you.
Because it is important, and again, given your work that you've done in South Africa, and we see the knock-on effects. And so, of course, when we think about colonialism, when we think about the apartheid government, when we think a lot of the conversations would be framed around, policy and the other ways in which we see it sort of still manifesting in society, but the structural injustices that were done and the impacts on families. And what we still see when we speak about absent fathers, when we speak about all of those, and we speak about particular associations or how men express, then we realize how much of it is linked to that. So it just, when I was reading this, I just thought that it was instructive almost for me, that given, yes, it's again, it's referred to as one of the harshest humanitarian crisis ever, and one thinks about those men, and now having to go into the process maybe after the ceasefire, even though we know there's still a lot happening, and reconstruction, and one thinks about men also being robbed of that ability to protect and provide to provide for their family. So I suppose that would then lead to the next question, and how would men then typically respond differently than as compared to men and women? Yes, given those associations and the stigmas and whatever, but then also in sort of, if one can ask the question this way, clinically.
So I think people cope in different ways with mental health problems. And again, I don't want to make as if the cause of distress and mental health conditions in Gaza is because of what goes on inside people's heads. The cause of it is political. The cause of it is human rights violations. The cause of it is social injustice. But having said that, and given the genocide, given the level of destruction, given the lack of safety that people have felt over the past 2 years, and the mass deaths that have occurred. I mean, you can imagine the grief, the bereavement, the trauma, the loss that people experienced. But I think people cope in different ways. Some people prefer to remain quiet, and I think this should be respected. There should be no compulsion on people to talk about what goes on with them. If they feel the need to talk about it and discuss it, then opportunity should be given for that. But some people prefer to remain quiet about what goes on with them psychologically. And I think there should be some respect for that. But some people do need to speak to others. And some, in fact, require professional help. And I think mental health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, counselors should be available in the Gaza context right now. And what I know is that there is a lot of work being done, but it doesn't meet the need that is currently occurring at the moment. The challenge is getting support to people in this difficult time of genocide. And I also want to call attention to people with psychotic conditions who need medication. Because you can imagine having hallucinations or delusions over the past couple of years when the bombs were going off all around you. I mean, the horror of that. It is really indescribable that people didn't have access to treatment in the context of all of these atrocities that were going on. So that also needs to be mentioned.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, my next question was going to be for you to perhaps take us through some of these conditions. Again, as lay people, we often sort of just box all of them anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it may be. And I say it exactly like that, with the type of not dismissiveness, but because we don't know as lay people. And then, of course, that's an important part of this conversation. The fact that many men within Palestine, as any other place in the world, had existing challenges, existing mental health conditions, which requires, yes, regular support and medication. Perhaps just first take us through some of these conditions that would have been that would sort of, that we can highlight. You know, when we speak about anxiety, what does it mean in the context of a genocide, as opposed to if we see it, you know, within our space, and how does it present, and so some of these conditions that would be most sort of pervasive.
Yes, so, well, anxiety is pretty much what we all know it to be: constant worry, a fear of apprehension that something bad is going to happen or is happening. And in the context of Gaza, this is a completely normal, natural response. If you are in constant danger of being killed, if your children are in constant danger of being killed, then anxiety, hypervigilance, worry, being alert, being watchful about any threats in the environment are correct and proper responses. So the report that you're referring to calls attention to the spread of these mental health conditions, the spread of anxiety in this population, and it is an appropriate, correct response under the conditions of severe threat that is constant. The other matter that the report talks about, and a lot of people probably know about, is post-traumatic stress disorder. And before I tell you about that, I do want to call attention to the fact that in Gaza at the present moment, I don't think the trauma is post. We are not past the set of events that have caused these things yet. The trauma is current, and over the past 2 years, it has certainly been current. But post-traumatic stress involves firstly an event that has taken place, and so people experience psychological symptoms as a consequence of that event or set of events. And there's hypervigilance, being watchful about any threat in the environment, having flashbacks about the event, having severe anxiety about the event, nightmares, what we call startle shock response, if some sound goes off and then the person responds in an exaggerated way, sleep disturbance, insomnia, emotional distress at reminders of the event, negative beliefs about the self, that because I'm having these difficult set of experiences, there's something wrong with me and I'm a failure and I'm a loser, so to speak. Angry outbursts are common, trouble concentrating. And you can imagine none of this is unexpected in the context of a genocide. If there are bombs going off around you all the time and there are more coming tomorrow, all of these things are going to be a natural, normal response under these conditions. The concern, though, is that now supposedly there's a ceasefire, and I really do hope it lasts. But what are we talking about going forward? These symptoms are going to continue for a lot of people in Gaza. The anxiety, the trauma that I've just spoken about, the grief when people lose loved ones, when parents lose their children, when children lose their parents. We've all heard about the amputations that people have experienced without anesthetic. And the pain and the horror of that experience. Imagine having your leg removed without an anesthetic. That memory of the pain is going to be with people for a very long time. And so people will have flashbacks, they will have insomnia, they will have nightmares, they will have fear, guilt, shame, angry outbursts as a consequence of these traumatic events that have occurred.
You mentioned shame now at the end, and I'm trying to think, how does that, if an occupation is imposed on you and a conflict is imposed on you, I'm just curious also to think why shame would be would even be something that one feels. But I also want to say it's so interesting when you speak about. I mean, oftentimes, you know, when we reference post-traumatic stress disorder, it also becomes something so one thing's about, say, in South African terms, so 1 year is maybe about somebody who experiences as a result of having been a victim of crime, and say maybe a particular heinous crime, and so one doesn't even think about that. I mean, how does one reference it? What do you term it when it's ongoing? The way in which you speak about it, where it's something that's just ongoing all the time. And then one thinks about, again, in our circumstances, you know, how often within sort of a modern society, we often pathologize everything. So a little bit, quote unquote, of anxiety, or a little bit and people, you know, self-diagnose all the time. But then I'm also thinking about the fact that if one looks at something physical, one can say, a doctor can say how incredibly serious it is, you know, given you look at you look at it from a, you know, a purely material perspective. To what extent can one do that when it's something psychological? You know, yourself as somebody who works in the space, who work with people, how does one even measure the depth or the seriousness of a mental health issue?
So there are a few ways. One is a diagnostic interview with a skilled clinician, a psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, counselor, who asks a set of questions that pertain to the symptoms that the person might be experiencing. For example, I've spoken about the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So a clinician would ask questions about the presence of a symptom, the duration, the severity, the intensity, and arrive at diagnostic impressions to determine whether the condition is present, and if it is, in what amount in terms of its severity. So that is a diagnostic interview. It does require someone with the appropriate skills, a confidential room, the amount of time allotted to conduct such an interview. A second way in which one can get a sense of people's experiences is through self-report questionnaires, by administering a set of questionnaires, and on the questionnaire or the psychometric instrument, there'd be a range of symptoms, and the respondent is then required to endorse or not endorse these symptoms in terms of their severity, how extremely they experience it, the duration, etc. And as a consequence of that, one gets a sense of how severe the condition is with that. Using self-report questionnaires, one can do that with a larger number of people because it's less resource intensive, and get a sense of the prevalence in a population of certain mental health conditions, and also then identify those people who can benefit from help, those people who can benefit from psychological support. So those are the two major ways in which mental health conditions come to the attention of professionals.
That was not just a slight sort of digression, but I was just curious, and I'm sure many of our listeners are as well, because again, because we live in this type of society, and I'm sure it's quite, let's just call it irksome for psychologists, because so much of what happens, you know, people. Or let's just use the term, it becomes pathologized. Everything seems to become like that. And exactly because mental health is not something that's as measurable as something physical.
So just to say, there's no clear line between ordinary human unhappiness and a psychiatric problem or a psychological problem. I think when you're doing epidemiological research in populations, the kinds of ways that I've spoken about become important, because you can get a sense of the prevalence of these conditions. But if someone is sitting in front of you and they're telling you about their lives and the experiences that they've
Yes.
had, one has to listen very carefully and to be able to identify the areas of concern so that a psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, etc., can then intervene in ways that are appropriate. And for many people, having a layperson to talk to is fine, a neighbor, a colleague, a family member, etc. But for some people who actually have a mental health condition, they require professional help because social conversations can only take you so far. You need a therapeutic conversation that is directed at ameliorating the symptoms
Yeah.
that people experience, that is going to be actually helpful with a psychological problem, a psychiatric problem. And in some instances, medication is also indicated.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think it's important for us, yeah, to be aware of that, so that one, again, just thinking in terms of a healthier society, and for us in spaces. But and as you were talking now, Prof, again looking to the report, and and yes, this you spoke now about the spread of mental health disorders, but of course also a very important part of this is, as we said earlier on, particularly vulnerable groups of people like children, and then one thing's about the boy child, and one thing's about the boy child that was particularly born during this period of time. So we know that many men have been born and raised, and many of them passing away while the occupation was happening since 1948. So their whole life has been living under these conditions of conflict, of a genocide. Um, I don't even know how to frame that question when it comes to the boy child. And again, because I'm so cautious about not clichéing these terms, or or sloganizing these terms like intergenerational trauma. Um, how does one even start with a child? Because how do you even gauge to what impact that child has been impacted and affected by what is happening? Um, and of course, again, that will be ongoing.
Let me refer to the work of my colleagues in Gaza who are currently providing mental health services to communities. They focus on children. They provide opportunities for children to talk about their experiences, and for those children who cannot talk about it, because sometimes it is difficult to talk about it, they create other opportunities like play and drawing and music and other forms of engagement that allow for some kind of emotional expression. I think it's important to call attention to the fact that many children have lost their parents, have lost family members, have lost siblings. So loss, grief play an important role in the way in which the children in Gaza, many of those children, are experiencing the world. I think as children grow up, those memories, those losses are not forgotten. They are kept in mind. And those children, as they grow up, require support. They require nurturing. They require containment. They require community and their families. Many children have been orphaned, and as we discussed, some of those children have had their limbs amputated. So that trauma, that loss, is going to play an important role in the way in which they think about the world. I do also think that people in Gaza want justice. They want a just peace. And they're in the throes of a political struggle against an oppressor, against an ethno-supremacist state. And so this is also a political struggle. And for a lot of children growing up, becoming youths, becoming adults, the whole idea of resistance to oppression plays an important role in the way in which they think about their society, their community, their families. So certainly that has been the case among the people that I've spoken to in Gaza, that there's not going to be any acceptance of defeat here, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and I realize it's sort of like it's an unfair question to pose to you in terms of the boy child that was born now, but knowing that again, boy children that were born post 1948 and the conditions under that they grew up under, and so one thing's about now that added layer that we spoke about earlier on, being the protector and the provider. So being a protector takes on a very different or a much, let's say, it's so much more magnified, because when we think about being a protector in South African terms for the average male person here, or the father here, what it entails, and then one thinks about what being a protector entails when you live under conditions of genocide, and you have these savages, these monstrous IOF, and they come, and the things that they do to the women, and how helpless men feel. And I realize, well, one realizes again from visuals that one sees that boy children grow up seeing this, seeing the helplessness perhaps of the male role model, be it the father or the uncle, in terms of when it comes to protecting women. Again, one thinks about traditional, and if one looks at the Palestinian society, that those traditions definitely apply, in terms of the role that men play, and so I just thought that's such it's such a harsh reality for boys that grow up under those circumstances, and then what that does to a family structure. And the roles that brothers play, because not all men are fathers. Some men are siblings, some men are sons, and what that does to their roles, or their ideas about the roles that they ought to play.
I think it does do something to the roles that they ought to play. I think, though, there's a strong sense of community in Gaza and in Palestine more generally, that families are close. Families tend to be also large, lots of siblings, lots of children, and in fact, the demographically, children and adolescents make up a large part of the society. There's this demographic pyramid, and at the bottom of the pyramid, the largest number of people are children and adolescents, and it certainly does affect family structure. And I don't want to romanticize family life in Gaza, because there is also I've heard of gender-based violence and spouse abuse and child abuse and various other forms of social ills that you see in many societies. And so this is certainly the case in Gaza as well. I've heard of cases, you remember the demonstrations that were held prior to the genocide, the Great March of Return, and these young men would go and march on in the area next to the fence with Israel, and they'd get shot. And the Israeli military made a point of shooting them in the lower half of their bodies, and many were disabled as a consequence of that. And then they'd go home to the hospital, and then they'd be heroes in their community for that day and be taken home, because tomorrow there's another hero, another person. So, but then the family has to manage this disabled young man who was shot by the Israeli military.
And for a moment was heroic.
Yes, exactly. But now the lived reality, the day-to-day grind, is a very difficult thing for a family that is already struggling, and now they have to accommodate and look after a disabled person, someone who can't walk, who's in a wheelchair, etc. So that has a significant effect on the way in which a family structure works. And I think the current genocide, with all the death, with all the grief, with all the destruction that has occurred, will in various ways affect the ways in which families operate, not least of which is the actual loss of people. The deaths that have occurred, the death of a parent or both parents, or the death of siblings, and coming to terms with that grief, coming to terms with that loss. And then, of course, how to make things work in a place where there's rubble, where there's destruction, where there's no accommodation, where there is a great deal of physical discomfort. Discomfort doesn't even begin to talk about it. But what do people need now? They need food, they need clean water, they need medicine, they need clothing, they need blankets, mattresses, tents, learning places, play spaces, that type of thing. And really, the humanitarian effort that is required now is immense, and that is what needs to happen at present.
I want to pick up on what you spoke about now, and that moment of being a hero and heroism. And I think it's very important that you mention the fact, or that you reference the fact that one doesn't want to romanticize a society that has all the realness of other societies. Yes, within a genocide, yes, within a conflict situation, under occupation, but all of those sort of that, or let's say, what's part of the human condition. Palestinians are not exempt from that, and so one thinks about that lived reality, as you pointed out now. Somebody who was in the news, or somebody who had that moment of being an absolute hero and adored, but we know how the world works nowadays. Then the next hero tomorrow. It's about what is it called, sound bites. And these visuals, and again realizing and recognizing the fact that Palestinian men are also would be incredibly frustrated, incredibly resentful, I suppose, at times, at being now somebody who's disabled. And I want to also link that with something else you mentioned earlier on, when you spoke about that Palestinians don't want to leave their land. So we hear a lot in narratives, a lot of narratives that refer to resilience and faith, and being a faith community, and that type of strength that one draws from that. So if one doesn't, and we never want to think about mental health as the one thing, that's in a little silo, physical health is in a little silo, and then again, Palestinians, like all human beings, are multifaceted. All of those elements and factors play a role. So speak to us about that, and about the role of faith and resilience and patience, and how that feeds into the mental well-being of men living under such extreme conditions for decades.
Religion is extremely important in Palestine, in Gaza specifically. Prayer is what everybody does. Most people are Muslim, the vast majority. There are Christians also, but most people are Muslim. I'm sure many people are familiar with the term Sumud. It's an Arabic term meaning steadfastness, perseverance, resilience, and it is a core Palestinian cultural and political concept. It represents the unyielding spirit of the Palestinian people to resist injustice and occupation, and it's expressed through everyday acts of living and surviving, even in the face of adversity. So, firstly, I want to say Sumud is important, and it's spoken about quite a lot. I do have to say, when all of the destruction was taking place in Gaza, over the past 2 years, I was wondering if Sumud applies as much as it did in previous times, because I want to acknowledge the importance of Sumud, but the idea of resilience, which I think is a little bit different from Sumud. Sumud is a political point of view. Steadfastness, perseverance, resilience. It's resisting oppression, but resilience, in my head, is an individual phenomenon, and I'm a little bit skeptical of resilience. That people need to bounce back from a stressful experience, that they need to develop mental toughness to overcome adversity, that they can succeed against all odds. And it places the emphasis on the individual rather than recognizing the problem as an oppressive social and political system. So I think it's helpful to think about Sumud and resilience as maybe overlapping, but a bit separate. And I worry that if we focus a lot on resilience, that there's the focus shifts then from the atrocities themselves to the ability of victims to endure them. And nobody's supposed to go through a genocide.
Them.
Yeah, nobody's supposed to go through a genocide in this day and age. And no population should have to withstand these unthinkable horrors. And the focus on resilience can overlook the deep trauma that people carry, and that they will likely carry over the next several years into the future. And survival under these awful conditions of genocide is not a badge of honor, it's a wound, and it should be considered a wound that needs to be addressed through various processes, including mental health support for people who require them.
Yeah, I would so much love for us to explore that further, and I'm sure for yourself as well as a researcher in this area, and having worked with marginalized communities like in South Africa, you see the overlaps there, in terms of how individuals are often burdened with responsibility, carrying responsibility of being somebody, or being or having a particular characteristic when one is not responsible for the external conditions that lead to it. So that's such an interesting point, I think to explore. And then of course then there's the idea of a Palestinian community, as you said, generally faith community, a big family. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on the collective, which is why the term Sumud comes into play. But I'd like for us to conclude, perhaps just in our last few minutes, with just a reminder from yourself as a researcher who sees, of course, and who's worked in South Africa and now works and you do your research on mental health, particularly we're speaking about men under conflict conditions. But why is it so important for us to understand that in global terms, so that we can, does it bring the conversation home in any way? What about it is so important, and how can these discussions really sort of inspire or lead to really important conversations about men's mental health, in our spaces as well?
I think we can all do some work in trying to destigmatize mental health in general, for people in general, and maybe for men in particular, and to create opportunities for people to firstly talk about their mental health conditions where they feel it's appropriate to do so, and then to make available appropriate treatments so that people can access them and have some relief from their mental health symptoms. In the context of Gaza, I don't think the solution is only psychological. Certainly there's a need for psychological services and psychiatric services, but it's also political, and we need to continue the pressure on Israel to stop occupying Palestinian land and to give Palestinian people their rights, the right of return, to stop settlers from occupying Palestinian land, to stop murdering people in their thousands. And the global community needs to step up to boycott, disinvestment, sanctions, the BDS movement. The ICJ case must go forward, and we need to boycott Israeli goods. We need to we really need to continue with campaigning to dismantle the ethno-supremacist Zionist state and create a state where everyone has equal rights in Palestine. I think that is the solution that will have downstream effects on both physical health and mental health for the Palestinian people.
No, absolutely. Shukran for that reminder. Yes, exactly. I mean, we said earlier on, we don't see these in little categories. We're only speaking about mental health. It's about the fact that due to an occupation and due to the structural violence that permeates the society by now, and that is why this is happening. That's causing, and so we have a responsibility as part of humanity, yes, to continue spreading awareness, yes, but also actively doing something. Prof, I can't imagine that we've run out of time so quickly. I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation. I think the one thing this conversation did is opened up many more avenues that we realized we want to talk about. But say shukran for your time.
Afwan, you're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.